Tom is standing on a bridge above a track. He can see that a trolley is heading down the track towards 5 people. If Tom wants to save the 5 people, the only way is to drop something very heavy in front of the trolley. And Tom notices a fat man standing next to him who is heavy enough to stop the trolley. Tom can push the fat man onto the track, which will kill him but save the 5 people. Should Tom push the fat man onto the track? Many point out that if the principle of consequentialism is followed, Tom should push the fat man onto the track. Because the principle of consequentialism is to maximize the overall utility. In order to maximize the overall utility, Tom should push the fat man onto the track. This principle has been criticized by many. They criticize the principle for only valuing the overall utility and ignoring individual utility. In order to maximize the overall utility, consequentialism permits violation of individual rights, which is injustice. However, this criticism is wrong. Consequentialism would never permit Tom to push the fat man onto the track. Why do critics make this mistake? Because their calculations of consequence are wrong. How to maximize overall utility? The overall utility can be maximized only if everyone in the community maximizes his or her own utility. As long as one person does not maximize his or her own utility, the overall utility cannot be maximized. Therefore, in order to maximize the overall utility, each person's priority goal is to maximize his or her own utility. It dictates that each of us has to be self-interested. Self-interest means that people have to compete with each other, that is, competition for resources. In order to compete for resources, mankind has fought countless wars over the past few thousand years. However, in order to survive, in addition to competition, humans also have to cooperate. Cooperation means that people have to share resources. Competition and cooperation are completely opposite. Without a powerful institution to coordinate, it is impossible for humans to compete and cooperate at the same time. Therefore, humanity has to need a powerful institution. We all know that this institution is the government. As a powerful institution, the government serves two main purposes. First, when people or groups compete for the same resource, the government has to adjudicate disputes to avoid competition getting out of control. Having the power to adjudicate means that the government has the power to allocate resources. Second, the government has to promote cooperation, even forcing everyone to cooperate at critical times. For example, when a foreign enemy invades, the government must be able to force people to enlist in the army in order to protect the homeland. Since the government has the power to allocate resources, how should the government allocate resources? Obviously, the aim of the government should be to increase the overall utility. Once the allocation of resources is optimal, the overall utility is maximized. How can a society optimize the allocation of resources? Theoretically, it is simple: allocate resources based on the individual's ability. The person with the most ability should be allocated the most resources because he can create the greatest utility for society. And the person with the least ability should be allocated the least resources. Since it is based on ability, what humans should do is to design a system that can test the ability of individuals. Then the government will allocate resources based on the individual's ability. However, before the 18th century, this system had not yet been invented, and the power to allocate resources was in the hands of a single person or a group of people. One person is dictatorship, and a group of people is feudalism. Such a government cannot be called a government at all, but a dynasty of individual. However, there is a serious flaw if the power to allocate resources is in the hands of people. The pursuit of self-interest by individuals dictates that people have to be selfish. Since people are selfish, it is impossible for them to allocate resources fairly when they have gained the power to allocate resources. They will inevitably use the power to illegally seize the legitimate resources of others, which is unfair competition. Unfair competition will inevitably severely distort the allocation of resources. Once the allocation of resources is severely distorted, the overall utility will drop to a very low level. However, there are some unrealistic fantasists who believe that not everyone is selfish. If we can find selfless people and give them the power to allocate resources, there will be no unfair allocation. Now we all know that this approach is not going to work. Even if the allocator is selfless, it is impossible for him to know the ability of everyone. If he can't know everyone's ability, he won't be able to allocate resources based on people's ability. Eventually, there will be a lot of mismatches and serious mismatches. Therefore, even if the individual subjectively wants to allocate fairly, in practice, it is impossible for him to achieve it, which in fact will inevitably lead to unfair competition. It is clear that in order to prevent unfair competition, no one is permitted to have the power to allocate resources. If we cannot rely on people, what do we rely on to allocate resources for us? In the 18th century, mankind invented a system, that is democracy. In a democracy, no one is permitted to have the power to allocate resources. This way it ensures that everyone is equal. Fair competition can only be achieved under the premise of equality. Fair competition means that everyone can only compete for resources by their own ability rather than power. Here we can see a significant advantage of democracy. As long as no one is permitted to have the power to allocate resources, resources can be automatically allocated based on ability. Since it's an automatic allocation, we no longer need to rely on anyone to allocate resources for us. The resources include not only wealth, fame, opportunity, and power, but also, in a broad sense, human life and organ, marriage, and so on. If anyone thinks that Tom should kill the innocent fat man in order to save 5 people, it means that Tom has the power to allocate lives. Obviously, this action is antithetical to the principle of consequentialism. However, this is not to say that under no circumstances should individuals be permitted to have the power to allocate resources. In fact, in some cases, the law permits individuals to have the power to allocate resources. One of them is bankruptcy. If a company files for bankruptcy, the business owner will not have to repay the debts to the creditors, which undoubtedly violates the rights of the creditors. In fact, there are some people who use this system to commit fraudulent bankruptcies. Obviously, if individual rights are inviolable, bankruptcy is not permitted. However, bankruptcy is now permitted in almost all countries. Why is bankruptcy permitted? It can only be explained by consequentialism. In order to evaluate the consequences of bankruptcy, we must list all the advantages and disadvantages and then weigh the pros and cons. What are the advantages of bankruptcy? If bankruptcy is not permitted, most people will not dare to take risks, which will greatly reduce the overall utility. Do the advantages of bankruptcy outweigh the disadvantages? We can find the answer from the facts. Now bankruptcy is permitted in almost all countries. It is clear that the advantages of bankruptcy outweigh the disadvantages.